Good afternoon. Hello, my name is Ishel Rosal, and I am the Associate Vice President for Student Life here at the university. And I am very happy to welcome you here today, to those of you in the room and also those of you who are joining us via the live stream. Today's event, Awakening Our Democracy, One Nation Under Guns, is the topic of our conversation today. We have a terrific panel lined up for you here, and I will introduce them in just a moment, but I wanted to share first just a few words about our office and about this series. So our office, which is the Office of University Life, is a hub for university-wide student life information, resources, and discussions like today's. We bring together students, faculty, and staff from across Columbia's many schools to be in conversations about pressing issues of our time. And for the students in the room, both in the room and via live stream, I want to invite you to join us for Campus Conversations, which are student-hosted discussions on identity and belonging that are happening throughout the year. In fact, this week, tonight and Friday, we are hosting 2 training sessions for folks who are interested in hosting a campus conversation. If you'd like more information either about any of our events or these training sessions, please visit our website, which is universitylife.columbia.edu. You can also find out more via our app and our social media platforms. We're here today for Columbia's flagship Awakening Our Democracy series that focuses on disparities and justice issues. And today's focus is the impact of guns in the U.S. and recent events that have shifted the national conversation. Guns are deeply ingrained in U.S. society. In fact, according to the Pew Research Center, about 4 in 10 adults either owns a gun or lives in a household where there is a gun. Many gun owners and gun advocates say the right to bear arms, as detailed in the Second Amendment, not only speaks to personal freedom, but also the ability to protect oneself and one's family. At the same time, gun violence, from individual incidents to mass shootings on college campuses, has spurred debate across the nation in both our state and national governments about limiting access to firearms. No matter your views, it's undoubtedly a topic that individuals are passionate about and has been the focus of much national debate, much like many of our conversations in this series. Many of you have shared questions for our panelists, and I'll share here just a few. Is it realistic to think that strategies to limit gun-related violence that have worked in other nations could work in a U.S. context? Can you talk about the connection between gun violence and gender violence? How can we incorporate race into conversations surrounding this idea of gun violence epidemics? Those are just a few, and thank you to those of you who submitted questions. I should add that we could spend the whole day together and still not get to all of the important issues to be discussed, which is why I encourage you to think about today's discussion as an opening to a conversation that can be carried on with your friends and classmates in the coming days, weeks, and months. So I will get us started by introducing our panelists who will add to our knowledge and perspective on this issue. So starting at the far end. Robert E. Fullilove is the Associate Dean for Community and Minority Affairs and Professor of Clinical Sociomedical Sciences at the Mailman School for Public Health. Professor Fullilove is also the co-director of the city's research group and has authored numerous articles in the area of minority health. Next, Cabot Phillips is a conservative political activist and American television personality. He is currently the media director for the conservative publication campusreform.org and serves as a director of campus outreach for the Leadership Institute, a conservative grassroots organization in Arlington, Virginia. Nick Suplina is the managing director for law and policy in Everytown. Prior to joining Everytown, he served as senior advisor and special counsel to the New York State Attorney General, where he formulated legal strategies in the areas of criminal justice, public safety, technology, and government integrity. Sonali Rajan is an assistant professor of health education at Columbia's Teachers College and a part of the nation's first regional gun violence research consortium. Her research is focused on identifying patterns of risk behavior among adolescent youth, implementing and evaluating school-based health education programs, and identifying environmental level characteristics that influence health behaviors among urban youth and communities. And finally, Tiffany Hsu, our moderator, is a breaking news reporter on the business desk. Before joining the Times in 2017, she covered economic news for nearly 7 years at the Los Angeles Times. She earned her MBA here at Columbia's Business School. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and I will turn it over to Tiffany Hsu. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are having this conversation about guns at a time when it kind of feels like there's so much happening and also so little happening in the gun debate, right? We're about 1 year out from the Parkland shooting, which set off really an unprecedented amount of activism, a lot of it from young people. This week, the House is expected to approve the first major gun control legislation in decades surrounding universal background checks. You have really a rush of legislation at the local level, both in support of gun control and also reacting against it. You have discussion about 3D printed guns, smart guns, and how to count and track and even confiscate guns. But at the same time, you have people saying that the momentum in gun control advocacy has waned, especially since the midterms. You have gun sales that, based on the kind of limited patchwork data that we have, that seem to be weakening, and whether that's because of cyclical issues or because because of the decline in hunting or because of the Trump administration's pro-gun policies sucking all the urgency out of the market. It's hard to say. So why don't we start off with kind of a broad question and just jump in by going down the row, starting with Nick, and just explaining why you think we should care about guns and why now.
Sure. Well, thank you. There are a lot of reasons to care about guns and a lot of reasons to care about them right now. So right now, according to the latest CDC data, gun deaths are on the rise. And we as a country are, and I'm sure we'll get to this more in the course of our discussion, but as a country are taking an interest in a new way, in an invigorated way on the issue, but it is not a new issue, and it is not just the time between horrific acts of mass violence that gun violence exerts a toll on the country and the states and communities within it. So I believe now is the time to talk about it because we have, I think, a lot of energy, a lot of interest, especially among young people, but also among portions of society that either haven't spoken up about this in the past or who haven't spoken together, which is really one of the most fascinating things from where I sit on the issue. So groups that have been working on gun violence at the most local level and national advocacy groups are having conversations that are probably overdue. And so it's a very exciting time, but really a dire time to be involved in the issue.
Okay, Sonali?
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Nick is saying here. So 40,000 Americans are killed with guns every year, 100,000 are injured, and far, far too many more are exposed, whether through witnessing gunfire, hearing gunshots. We actually don't really know what the extent of exposure to gun violence is in the United States, but we do know it's certainly at epidemic proportions. So yeah, my question is really why haven't we been trying to address this sooner and with more urgency, much like we would react to any other infectious disease or security threat that was killing thousands of Americans every year?
Okay, Cabot?
First, I'm just excited to be here. I'm very looking forward to learning from everyone on the stage and the questions as well, so thank you for having me. And I think it's important to talk about guns because this is such a polarizing time in America in general that we need to try and talk about every issue, especially something like guns that so many Americans have strong opinions on. And I think as the political climate becomes more polarized in general, if we don't talk about it now, it's only going to get harder down the road to talk about it. And so I think that rather than kicking it down the road and saying, oh, we can have discussions and debates about this in the future, I think if the trends continue and if we continue as both sides on the gun control issue to not discuss it, I think it's going to be harder to do that in the future. And so I think right now is the time to do it and to also put aside many misconceptions that both sides have. And I think by having important conversations, we can better understand where each side is at. I think that's beneficial to us as Americans because this is obviously an issue that affects many people and have strong opinions on.
Okay, Rob?
I think for me, the most important part of this conversation that fascinates me is one that's related to my age. I was born in 1944, which means that last month I celebrated my 75th birthday. So I do this shamelessly, you'll have to forgive me. As soon as you mention age in a crowd of young people, you get applause because people are so happy to see you're still alive. I've been really interested to watch the evolution of American culture. I grew up at a time when our films were not about science fiction, they were about Westerns, the conflict between cowboys and Indians. And every kid on the block probably at some point in time got a Christmas gift that included carrying a gun in a holster so that you could look like Roy Rogers. Or if you were a girl, you could be Dale Evans. The watchful ways in which we as a society have evolved our discourse about guns is something that I'm really fascinated by because as a nation, we're also kind of clueless about history. My experience of young people is that for them, history began the day they were born. Everything that happened before is something of an abstraction. So the idea that we've had ongoing conversations about gun, first as a kind of a romantic element of the conquest of the West, to now from a public health standpoint being abundantly clear that the presence of a gun exacerbates everything from intimate partner violence to suicide, really means that there's a historical context to the conversation that I think is also very important. Because our identity as a nation was fundamentally caught up in the organization of militias and the rights of Americans to carry guns to defend themselves as well as to defend their homelands. So the old guy in the audience is really interested in what everybody has to say.
So this is super interesting. Just off the bat, you can see how complex this conversation has to be fundamentally, right? This debate about guns gets framed as being about the Second Amendment, being about freedom of speech or public health or race or gender. And that just reminds me of something you said, Cabot, about how polarizing this naturally is, right? Within each of these various frames of this very broad conversation, you have people who butt heads, right? So how do we talk about this in a productive way when right now on the Hill you have Democrats really just talking amongst Democrats and Republicans really just talking amongst Republicans? Sonali, I'm going to knock this over to you. I want to hear what you think.
I have so many opinions. If my students are in the audience, they'll be like, she's just going to talk forever now. No, I won't do that. So I actually think this is an issue where we have more in common than is often discussed or tweeted about, for example. So sometimes it seems like the impression is it's this side versus that side. But I think if you talk to any person, any parent, regardless of party affiliation, they would say, yeah, I want my kid to be safe. I want to send them to a school. I want them to come home that day, right? I want to be able to go to my place of worship and be there without the fear that someone will come in with a lethal weapon. I don't think these are things that Americans disagree on. Where I think the discourse lies is in the best way to do that. And so the hat that I wear most of the time is that of a researcher, where I turn to, and my colleagues turn to, the existing peer-reviewed research and the rigorous data to use that to inform evidence-based solutions. And I think that's where we really want the conversation to lie.
Okay, so let's talk about research. And by the way, feel free to jump in at any point, everyone on this panel. The research is patchy, right? For quite a long time, the CDC has effectively been blocked from looking into gun violence. And when Jersey last year started publicizing its gun data, it was a really big deal. So do we know enough about guns and gun usage to effectively talk about this debate? What do you all think?
If I could just
Yeah, of
add,
course.
okay. See, I'm doing it already. So, just the research is patchy in that there is considerably less research because there has been considerably less resources dedicated to the study of this issue. The research is not patchy on what the solutions to gun violence can and should look like. So in the context of making it harder to get access to lethal firearms, that is understood. The gun violence prevention researchers, injury prevention researchers, epidemiologists, emergency medicine physicians, child health specialists, we are all in agreement. There is room for a lot more effective gun reform at the federal level. it has its place in contributing to the reduction of gun violence across the U.S., across communities, across demographic subgroups. So I want to be clear about when we use the word patchy in the context of research, it's not really in terms of what we know, it's in terms of where the resources and funding have been.
Nick, you're nodding.
I agree entirely. And I think for this audience, maybe to dwell a little bit on why it's patchy. So for a public health issue of this size, the stats have already been said, it is a chronically underfunded and not accidentally underfunded issue, right? This was a goal of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, and the gun lobby to make sure that we weren't studying the causes of gun violence, because some of the solutions to that gun violence might undercut their bottom line. And so we're only now recently seeing some infusions of capital at the state level into research, and maybe we'll see a little bit more at the federal level based on some recent changes in law. But the research we do have is consistent. It's pretty simple, some of the things that you can do at a federal, state, or, like I said, local or hyper-local level to reduce gun violence.
Cabot?
Yeah, I think touching on one thing we're talking about is I think one reason that so many people are afraid to have conversations like this is because of the fear of being labeled as a traitor to your own cause if you suggest any sort of compromise. And myself personally, I'm a conservative. I support more universal background checks. I think that would be a positive step forward in buying a gun and getting a background check. I think for me, it seems like common sense. And I have friends in the Second Amendment community that call me a sellout and say, "Oh, come on, you're going with the gun grabbers." And
We're going to
think,
steal you to our side by the end of today. That's my goal.
And so I think that's one problem that, there's I think the base of each side has the far right and far left has such a hold on people that are, willing to be more moderate on that. And so I think that's one problem. And also on the left, I think there are people that on the left that when they do stand up and say, hey, I don't think that we should be banning, high capacity magazines. I don't think that handguns are the problem. I don't think this is the problem. Also them being called out by the far left on their side as being, going with the gun nuts. And I think that's one reason that conversations are so hard when even, for example, on the background checks, many Republicans actually agree that more background checks are something that would help gun violence and would be a positive thing. But because there's that small, very, very vocal minority in the party, I think there's a lot of fear of being labeled as a sellout. And I think that's present on both sides and one reason why there's so much polarization.
That's interesting, this talk of moving to the polls, right? Where I think a question that comes up whenever I write stories is, well, why are gun owners so attached to their guns? Why do you need a gun in your daily life? And then that's when you talk to the people who are lifelong hunters or people who just enjoy sport shooting or people who want to protect their families. Where do those people fall in the gun control debate, and are they heard often enough?
Well, one of the things that characterized my early research in public health is that Nick Suplina and I, early on in the 1980s, started looking at crack cocaine use as a way of understanding rising rates of sexually transmitted disease, and ultimately the impact that crack was going to have on the HIV epidemic. As soon as we got to New York City in 1990 to start work at the School of Public Health, we found ourselves in Washington Heights, which at that point in history had the highest homicide rate of any other neighborhood in Manhattan. One became fascinated by the fact that crack cocaine sales had a great deal to do with having money in the community that was used to buy guns to defend gun territory, to defend crack-using territory. But what happened was it wasn't just folk who were selling and using, it was also folk in the neighborhood who felt that they had to defend themselves against this sudden rise in the presence of guns. So you would think in a neighborhood that had high rates of gun-related homicides that everybody would be against guns. Not really. The debate is even more complicated within these communities where they may not look like the gun lobby, but their concerns are much more about, hey, this neighborhood, what are we going to do? And how is this debate going to affect us? Will we be able to protect ourselves in a neighborhood where we're as afraid of the cops as we are of the bad guys? Folks in Washington Heights used to worry as much about the police, feeling that they were at some levels an occupying force and their use of guns, as they were against the folk that the police were supposedly pitting themselves against. The folk who were dealing cocaine and who were keeping guns in their presence to just defend what they have. I mean, having that conversation in Washington Heights was itself in the 1990s a very, very complicated affair, and it depended fundamentally on who you talked to.
So how do we bring the voices in Washington Heights into Washington? How do we bring those perspectives to the fore so that people can understand that the gun debate actually maybe isn't as polarized as it's often made out to be?
Well, I think, again, that the capacity that we have to do research that really looks at things like this means that we'll start to extend our reach to include voices that haven't been heard from before, but which now can be in a position to speak, so that there'll be a much broader perspective of how to think about these issues. I also teach in New York State prisons. I'm part of the Barred Prison Initiative. Right now, I've got a group of young men who plan to present a public health fair. I teach public health courses that will basically have someone talking about, from an inmate standpoint, what do we know about the control of guns and about ways in which we can use the technology, rather than many of the things that we've talked about here, to make guns less lethal. I'm really interested in what they have to say, because if they get involved in the conversation, given the fact that at least half of my students probably at the time of their arrest had guns somehow involved one way or another, I'm interested in what their voices are going to contribute to this conversation.
And I think to touch on when you asked about the message of average gun owners being represented, and I think that there are a lot of gun owners around America that feel like their views are being misrepresented, or they get frustrated about the conversation being had around guns. And I know a lot of gun owners that feel as if, hey, they've grown up around this culture of firearms. It's something that is kind of innate to their culture and their livelihood. And so when they hear the conversations around gun control, I think there's a lot of frustration where they think people don't understand their lives or giving them a bad reputation as gun owners, the majority of them not breaking the law in any way. And also I think the way that we talk about firearms can be upsetting to actual firearm owners, because there's a lot of misinformation. And I have plenty of friends that say, well, I'm a firearm owner and I own a AR-15, a much maligned rifle, and I own an AR-15. And when people talk about semi-automatic rifles, they don't seem to understand that semi-automatic just means I pull the trigger once and a bullet is discharged. And I think a lot of gun owners get frustrated by people that they view as not understanding the complexities of gun terminology and semantics, making these sweeping claims about firearms. And I think that's one reason a lot of gun owners get frustrated around the debate around guns and might be more polarized.
I would posit another reason, though, that gun owners, whether at the local level seeking to protect themselves from crime on the street, or in rural areas where police response times are not going to be an effective solution, or whatever reason you've chosen to have a firearm in your home, or for hunting and sporting and the like. And that is the misinformation that does polarize the debate. And that when we are talking about something like background checks, and just again for the sake of the audience, right, at the point of sale in a commercial gun dealer, you are going to submit yourself to a federal background check. And they're going to look at whether you have a criminal history, some disqualifying records that as part of the law says you can't have a firearm. This is, in almost any audience I've ever spoken to, and in polling well over 90% of Americans, including well over 80% of gun owners, all see that as, they think it happens everywhere. They think it is the rule of the land. But they don't know, for instance, that if I'm not selling as a gun dealer but selling as myself, or selling over the internet as a private seller, that background check doesn't occur. Yeah. The whole debate that you may have been maybe following right now in Congress is just about that question, whether those private sales should be subject to background checks. And it is a non-controversial, non-political, super simple, and very baseline solution to one part of the gun debate, which is just the part about at the point of sale, keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people or people who otherwise shouldn't have a firearm. And the response, though, from, and I'm going to keep coming back to it today, and sometimes a villain is a straw man, but here I find the NRA to be really the culprit. They look at this really modest change in the law, and all they can say is they're coming to take your guns. This is just the beginning. They're not coming with good intent. They want to criminalize that sale of your firearm to your uncle that you made last month. And the misinformation is highly prevalent, and gun owners who are not part of the NRA, and by the way, to the statistics noted at the top of the hour, let's say there's 100 million gun owners in the country, 5 million NRA members, okay? A very small portion of gun owners are represented by that lobby, by that advocacy group, and yet they are the outspoken voice, and they are the ones that are saying, this is not background checks. This is the beginning of the end of your right to hunt, to protect your family. And I will tell you, there is no shortage of ad hominem attacks against those that speak in favor of it. And so I feel rather strongly that if that voice was muted, and we're seeing it being muted in some interesting ways, if that voice was muted and we just heard from gun owners, we would see the politics fall quickly. Now, some of the same issues will come up, but you're not respecting my, there's a gap to bridge, but it is not a wide span.
Well, a theme that I'm seeing throughout all of these comments, right, is that there's this belief that the gun control debate needs to be focused more on a community level, right? Because perspectives on how to use guns, how to own guns, how to control guns really is something that should be determined within more of like a personal space, right? And so you see kind of an influx of laws that are happening really on the local stage, right? You have red flag laws in places like New York and California, and then you have reactionary laws, or not reactionary laws. You have laws that promote like sanctuary areas for guns. Is that the way maybe the gun control debate should go, is focusing more locally so that you can adjust to various populations of gun owners? I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads here.
I think, so just building off what Nick was saying, I think the idea also is that those of us in favor of gun reform are anti-Second Amendment. I think that's a myth that also gets pushed by the gun lobby that isn't true. And this idea that we would be criminalizing gun owners isn't true. To answer your point, there was actually a great paper that just came out yesterday in JAMA talking about firearm policies that work. And that work, in conjunction with quite a bit of existing research, again, in the policy arena, has spoken to, and this is even just sort of common sense if we think about it, but the need for legislation that helps us regulate firearms in a way that at the federal level so that we can coexist as a society with firearms in a safe way, right? I don't think that's something that anyone would disagree on, those who own guns and those who don't. The federal level piece is really important, and I personally and professionally feel it's really important to advocate for that because A, we know it works, federal legislation at the federal level, but also because guns cross state lines. Like we are a United States we have 50 different states, and that's great, and that's the beauty. We can go from New Jersey to New York to Pennsylvania, and I can bring my gun across state lines. We know from existing research, we can use Chicago as an excellent case study of this. Chicago is very close to Indiana. Illinois has relatively stricter gun laws. Indiana does not. So when we say, when we start to dissect, like we can certainly, I'm not saying that legislation at a local or a state level doesn't matter. It certainly does. And that can allow us to speak to the nuances and the needs of specific communities within those states. But I feel like on this issue, like many other public health issues, there is a critical need to implement legislation at the federal level, and that needs to happen now. The fact that it hasn't happened, honestly, is far too late. We are now kind of reacting to the thousands and thousands and thousands of American lives that have been taken as a result of this epidemic. So I feel very strongly that we not say, let's get comfortable at the local level, see how we feel about it, let's wait another year. No, too many people are going to be dead by then. I mean, that's just a fact. That's not even exaggeration. So and that's also driven by the evidence. If we kind of go back to using or advocating for evidence-informed solutions, that's a really big piece of this.
So I want to make a second that notion and make a point to your first question, though, also about the evidence, which is we are a nation of states. I absolutely think the fight, by the way, is at the state level, not for the reasons maybe you were saying about the unique cultures embodied in a state. Of course, in a state like New York, it's a big state. New York City is not Buffalo, and Buffalo is not it's not upstate New York. So I do think that that sensitivity is best met at the state level, and that is where the fight has been, and that's where the fight's been for 20 years, but there hasn't been anybody on sort of the gun safety side of the debate that's been showing up until, quite recently. But to the interstate point, I mean, in my former life at the Attorney General's office, we did comprehensive analysis of trafficking of firearms interstate. And in New York City right now, you might have, New York State and city might have some of the best laws in the country. 95% of the guns recovered in crimes in the city didn't start in New York State. And so even from a public safety standpoint, that makes protecting New Yorkers this interstate issue. And so that's where the federal government should really be coming into play, in my view. But furthermore, even as you're trying to evaluate laws, you have to, and I know of no research who have been able to do this because the data is difficult to come by. But how do you even measure the efficacy of a law in a state when 95% of the guns used in the ways that you want to regulate are coming from out of state? You're legislating despite the deficit.
So as we see efforts like H.R. 8, which is the legislation that's in Congress this week, as those efforts continue to create kind of a federal foundation for gun control legislation, do we look to other countries and look at what's come to pass after, let's say, like Australia after Port Arthur, right, or Japan, which gets brought up quite often for their strict gun legislation? Can we use lessons from the global stage and apply them here at home?
I would say it's difficult. First off, I think Australia is a common one we heard and discussed. I think one reason it's difficult is because gun culture is ingrained so much more deeply in the United States than most other countries where we've seen legislation like this passed. And also because I think when people talk about an example like Australia, for example, when the gun buyback happened in 1996, only about a third of gun owners actually turned over their guns to the government. So there's still 2/3 of the people there didn't give up their guns in the first place. And we look at the gun data, people like to bring up that after the gun buyback there was a noted decrease in gun violence. Gun violence rates were already decreasing pretty consistently throughout the first half of that decade. And so it's hard to know if the decrease in gun crime was actually because of the buyback. And even here in America, I think a lot of people, they talk in these vague generalities about gun control. And I think that's one reason that it's hard to have those discussions. If people are advocating for a gun buyback here in the United States, fair enough, let's have that discussion, let's have that debate. But I think very few people are actually willing to say, here are the policy prescriptions that I want in the United States to advocate for. And I think that's one reason it's very hard to actually nail down a specific debate, because legislation is discussed in these very vague terms. I think that's a problem.
Okay.
I just want to add again a point from my students on the inside. One of the things they'll tell you is that never had to pay a dime to get hold of a gun. They're just here, they're available. The reason they start to talk about favoring technological solutions is that sales weren't an issue. They just weren't. It wasn't about going to somebody and forking down money. If you knew somebody who had a gun, you could always find a way to get one. And if we're concerned about this as a way of deterring problems that are related to gun-related crime, their point that you're focusing on the wrong problem is one that I think is really important. Their idea is that we should be using technological advances to help us figure out where guns are. The notion that some things could be done with ammunition of all things, so that it would become that much easier to sort of figure out where guns are, who has them, when they've been used, and under what circumstances. What I like about the fact that this is being proposed is, number one, it comes from folks who know what they're talking about. Number two, it doesn't involve complex legislation, and it doesn't require that we have the debates that we've been talking about thus far about the rights of gun owners versus the rights of people who don't have them. If we think that this is a technological problem and start to look for technological solutions, some of the issues that we've been talking about thus far might just disappear. And I don't know that that's enough a part of the current conversations about what we do to control all the issues that are created by the presence of so many guns in our society. But look, they're already out here. This is really late in the game. We needed to have done this pretty much at the turn of the century. But now that there are hundreds and thousands, if not millions and millions of guns that aren't being tracked, that are already there, that aren't a part of anybody's sale receipt, thinking through what we do about that and liking the notion that because you have to buy ammunition, even if it's an old gun, that maybe there's something there that we should be thinking about. I don't know what that looks like, but I like it as a new avenue to have the kind of research, now that we've got the resources, to look at some solutions that don't involve us in the legislative quagmire that I see us struggling with right now.
Can you build just a little more on this idea of the technological solutions? Are you talking about smart guns, or is this something else?
Well, no, I've heard a variety of things mentioned. And again, it's not something that I study. I'm fascinated to have somebody who is in a classroom that's in the middle of a prison suddenly talk about, yeah, let's think about technology as a way of doing this, literally speaking from their own experiences as ways in which all the debates don't get at the issues that, for many of them, put them on the inside, put them in a prison cell to begin with. Just noting that there is much understanding of the technology and its potential, not just smart guns, thinking about tracking, tracing, use, counting. I mean, I think all this stuff is fascinating, and if we're not spending the money on that, then maybe we're missing a bet. I think that's the major point that they would be making.
I think just to build upon what my dear colleague here is sharing, I think the idea also that the solution to the epidemic of gun violence in the United States is not purely about one particular law over another, but that if we treated it like any other public health issue, we would really be looking at all ways in which we wanted to prevent violence. So that means addressing the big picture. It's a multidisciplinary idea of looking at how are we supporting schools, are there truly comprehensive mental health resources and support systems? What are we doing for those individuals who are perpetrators of interpartner violence? How are we intervening then? Before they get access to a gun, what are we doing on that prevention side? Look at how we address issues of obesity, of drinking and driving, of clean water. I mean, think about any other public health issue that we address through multiple lenses. We draw on the resources. We don't just pin it on one piece of legislation. We don't polarize it. We just say, this is to the benefit of the public, is to think creatively about these solutions. And I will just say, kind of in the vein of what researchers have been doing in this space, they have been thinking outside of the box, which is a remarkable testament to the quality of work that's gone into thinking about how do we actively implement efforts to reduce that level of violence. So whether that there's a technological piece there, whether it's drawing on environmental level issues, looking at the role of schools, prevention, and policy, all of that together can come into play. The challenge is you can't have gun violence without a gun, to quote one of my good colleagues and friends. So I would say there is a role for policy and legislation, there is a role for technology, there is a role for real and effective prevention, and we need to think together on that, and that's where I see the coming together of sort of the two sides, saying, well, where do we share that common ground? I would love, after every mass shooting, we hear, oh, it's a mental health issue, da da da. Sure, that's definitely it. I would love to see then the Republicans who are saying that advocate for truly comprehensive mental health care in all public schools in the United States. We don't see that. We don't see that follow-up. So, and I'm not, actually I wouldn't even put it on just the Republicans, I would put it on all elected officials. We have that responsibility to say, all right, if you're saying it's not the gun and it's this issue and we should have intervened earlier, then what are we doing about it? And I think if we compare this again to other public health issues, we can see those analogies very, very clearly.
Right, so it's not so much where you fall on that classic
Exactly.
argument. It's
Right.
not guns that kill people. It's people
Absolutely.
that kill people. Just so I understand, it sounds like what you're saying is it doesn't really matter where you come down on that. You should look for solutions on either side of that argument, or on a spectrum of that
I
argument.
would say that I think it matters a little bit, but I think it should matter. I think we should all, as citizens and to just be civically engaged, take the time to understand the nuances of this issue and understand why we feel a certain way about it. But I do think that there is room for apolitical solutions. Also, why are we politicizing policy? Like, that seems, we don't do that again. We don't do that on other health issues. We don't. When we think about vaccines, or well, maybe that's vaccines. Okay. When we think about car, yeah, like drinking and driving is an issue that I think is a really excellent analogy. Thank you, Nick. He's clearly done this more. My students would know better than to tell me they don't vaccinate their kids or whatever. So I think the notion that like in drinking and driving, okay, sure, like. People could say alcohol doesn't kill people. People kill people. People who drink alcohol kill people. Well, Yeah, that's true. But you know what? We have BAC levels that are set that say if your BAC level is above a certain level, and you're caught driving under the influence, there's repercussions for that. We have laws at the federal level that help us regulate and keep our roads safer. We have advocacy efforts, both locally and nationally, starting with the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Right? We saw that evolution of those policies. And now it's just a given, right? You get into a car, if you've had 2 margaritas, you have a designated driver. It's not a political issue, it's a safety issue. In the same way, gun violence is not that much different. The challenge is, to Nick's point earlier, which I just thought was really excellent, we have had this sort of one voice, and you spoke to this as well, which I thought was really powerful. We've had this sort of the voice of very few taking up a lot of space. And I think it's fascinating that we're hearing both sides of the debate, so to speak, speaking to that, which makes me wonder, apropos what you both said, where is then the room for that middle ground? And I think there's a lot of room for that middle ground.
Well, I thought it was really interesting, especially after Parkland, when you had businesses getting involved, right? You had Larry Fink from BlackRock, you had Ed Stack from Dick's, you had Delta pulling out of like the NRA partnerships. What do you make of corporate America getting involved on this front? Should they play a larger role? Should policy be made through how you spend your money? Should credit card companies and banks and other financial institutions lead the way?
Well, I think they should be the. Whoops. I think that was a long time coming, actually, especially with my hand gestures. I think corporations should lead the way, but I think actually what corporations do better than anybody else is know where their customers are, and their customers are the American people. And so the fact is they're not really leading the way, they're listening. They're listening to their customers, they're listening to the American public, and they're saying, we are corporate citizens, we have to do something about this. Now, some CEOs are motivated by strongly held personal beliefs, others have been motivated by the employees in their company who, to the Sonali's earlier point, our estimates are that 58% of Americans either know somebody, or either personally or know somebody who has been impacted by gun violence. And that means that in American corporations, your employees have been impacted by gun violence. And so I think companies are going to act in different ways, depending on what kind of companies they are, depending upon how they're led. But I think it's right, and it's right because that's where the American people are. They ultimately are making apolitical decisions, and decisions that reflect what they think they need to do to serve the communities they serve, the customers they serve.
Cabot, what do you think?
I don't have a problem with corporations getting involved. I'm a big advocate for free speech. I think that would be a better solution than others. However, I think I disagree to a certain extent. I think that the role of a corporation is ultimately to make money, either for its shareholders or for its employees. And I think that Michael Jordan has a famous saying about why he never talks about politics, and he said Republicans buy shoes too. And I think that a lot of corporations are alienating a large portion of their base when they make measures like this. And so I don't have a problem with it from a morality perspective. Of course, people have the right to speak up and use the platform that they've earned in America. You have that right. But I don't necessarily think it's the wisest thing to do.
Gotcha.
I just want to add one thing, though. It's very important. Let's be clear that workplace violence, someone walks into an office and then shoots everybody who's there. That's new. That wasn't a part of the American scene, if you forgive my analogy to what happened in the deep, dark past. That's a relatively new development for all of us, and corporations are as concerned about what happens in their offices as they are with their customers. So they should be involved, because if somebody in a Walmart who's got a beef with everybody else that they're working with suddenly comes to work because they're about to be fired and starts shooting, it becomes something that's not just about customers, it's also about the place of business.
Right.
And to the bottom line point, what if that gun was purchased at a Walmart, right? I mean, there's a reputational risk associated with being in the industry. There's a value to reducing risk by having responsible corporate practices.
Which is what happened with Dick's and Ed
exactly.
Stack. Let's take a few questions from the audience. Anyone? Bueller? Yes.
How do you guys feel about harder punitive? Hi, I'm Kent Taylor.
Hi, Ken Taylor.
I work at CUIT. How do you guys feel about hard punitive and criminal damages for manufacturers and distributors?
because I think that would be a really good step in, controlling, where these guns are coming from, and, the lack of being able to identify who has them. So.
Thanks, Ken. We're going to take 2 more and just do a round robin of answers. Yes.
I'm Sophia. I'm an undergrad at Columbia College. You mentioned that people who advocate for more gun reform aren't anti-Second Amendment, and I know there was a sort of well-publicized John Paul Stevens op-ed in the New York Times that I think was saying it's time to repeal the Second Amendment, and I wondered what you thought the value of that argument was, if you thought the backlash made it actually less helpful to the gun control, if you thought it was good that someone was even presenting that in the first place.
Thanks.
That's a good one.
Great question.
That was
In the back.
I'm Yehudis. I'm from the engineering school. I'm wondering what you have to say about the fact that stricter criminal background checks may discriminate certain groups. Has that been considered?
Okay, great. So criminal ramifications for manufacturers, Second Amendment, and then discriminatory background checks. Who wants to go first?
I thought
Are we doing all of them at once? Should we do?
We can focus on.
Maybe do one at a time.
Yeah, let's do one at a time. You're right. Why don't we go to Ken's question about the ramifications for manufacturers? If there should be
I
any.
personally wouldn't support legislation like that or policies like that. I think that if you have a gun manufacturer that is selling firearms legally under the laws that we have right now, I don't think that they should be held responsible for the actions of people that purchased that firearm. I think it's similar to saying that Budweiser would be held accountable if someone went out and drank a 12-pack and drunk driving. I don't think it's Budweiser's fault that a person misused their product, or the same thing of saying that Twitter should be held accountable for people using their platform to bully someone else. I think that's a similar.
Maybe Twitter should be held accountable, right?
Probably a bad analogy there. Good point. But I think in general, if manufacturers are selling legally under the laws that we have right now, I don't think that they should be held accountable for actions down the road from people once it's their own property.
So there's that, and I do think.
Actually, that wasn't the question. The question was the lack of, let's just say you have Smith & Wesson selling, they have a lot of 1,000 guns.
Mm-hmm.
500 of these guns just disappear.
Right.
That is the question.
Should they be held liable for lots of missing guns?
Well, let's talk first about why they're not. Okay, because you, I think, know the answer, but others may not, which is there's a federal law prohibiting civil liability to gun manufacturers and sellers for the actions of third parties at the end. So it's not about enacting legislation, it would actually be about repealing legislation to allow for the American system of liability to do what it has done in so many industries, which is by increasing liability for certain acts or negligence, you increase responsible conduct, and that's kind of part of the fabric of the way the country works, especially if you don't want government solutions. And so, yes, exactly. Maybe immunity should apply to Smith & Wesson if an individual who passes a background check goes out and uses the gun in a bad way. But what about when Smith & Wesson, through its distributor channels, has sold the same gun store 1,000 guns over and over again, and those guns keep ending up in crime scenes, and Smith & Wesson knows it? What about that? What about knowing your customer in the gun industry, just like banks need to know their customers in the banking industry? Or quite honestly, like pharmaceutical companies. So a lot of interesting cases right now about pharma selling opioids to the same clinics that are ordering way too much oxycodone. Can't possibly be a demand for it. And so we're seeing liability there. We're seeing reforms in distributor practices and marketing practices as a result. So some change in the liability regime, I believe it would be seismic, actually, in what guns are marketed, how they're marketed, and definitely how they're sold.
Let's jump quickly to the question about repealing the Second Amendment. Sabi?
So I read that op-ed. Personally, I was nodding along as I read it. But in terms of, as someone who thinks a lot about how do we move forward on this issue, I don't think that the solution lies in repealing the Second Amendment. I think the solution lies in a combination of common sense gun reform, which includes universal background checks, waiting periods, making it harder or impossible for someone who's a perpetrator of domestic violence to get their hands on a lethal firearm. I think something like the federal assault weapons ban, which we know during that period there was a significant reduction in gun massacres, which my colleague cites as 6 or more people killed in a given shooting, dropped precipitously during that time, and then rose significantly in the years thereafter. Those kinds of legislative efforts we know work. None of those legislative efforts require banning the Second Amendment. It goes back to this idea of how do we coexist with firearms safely and responsibly and honestly through common sense, right, in our communities. I think, my husband grew up on a farm in upstate New York. I love my in-laws deeply. I spent now 14 years going to their home. It is a part of the New York State where there is a high prevalence of gun and gun ownership. They understand, so I'm deeply connected to families personally who own guns and who own guns responsibly, but who also deeply understand what the responsibility of gun ownership looks like. I think that culture can be respected while also saying that we don't need lethal weapons that are designed to kill quickly and efficiently out for civilian use. I think there is, I think there's common ground. So we don't need to repeal the Second Amendment in order to find that common ground.
Rob, can you talk a little bit about addressing the final question, these concerns that background checks could have a discriminatory effect? How do we look at gun buyers in a way that doesn't discriminate?
Very difficult to do. I do a lot of writing on mass incarceration, and if you look at the problems that we had in this city with stop and frisk, the presumption of guilt, the presumption that you'd committed a crime that was made just because you were black or brown and in the wrong neighborhood resulted in abuses that it took the state Supreme Court ultimately to overturn. So yes, we were already worried about racial profiling in American life. The whole notion that walking or talking while black can now suddenly involve you with an encounter in the police makes it very, very clear that any kind of solution that has the capacity to discriminate and reinforce this tendency to have to engage in ethnic profiling is something you have to be really, really careful about. I cite a lot of statistics that I've seen other people tell me are on White Citizens Council and Ku Klux Klan websites, where they do the same numbers about what's the proportion of African American males who are locked up. 6% of the American population, 42% of the population doing time in state and federal prisons. Doesn't that tell a policeman that being black and a male automatically is a presumption of something other than innocence? And if we start to conduct our policing with that kind of notion about what our job should be about, yes, I think we're going to see way more problems that are associated with that profiling. And we're certainly going to see a lot more in the way of the problems we're having with the community and the police in too many areas of the fabric of the urban United States. I worry about it a lot.
Gotcha. Let's do one more round of questions. Anyone? Yes.
Okay, hi, I'm Mary Ellen Novak. I'm from the School of Professional Studies. Completely agree with everything you said with the NRA. I can't stand them. People like Marion Hammer and Dana Lash and Wayne LaPierre have to just be fleshed out and held accountable. But the one thing that I'm really concerned about is the law that is going to be addressed in the Supreme Court, which is challenging the New York City Gun Carry Act, and being able to take your firearm from your home into a gun show. And the reason why that really concerns me is, one, because Brett Kavanaugh is now on the Supreme Court, and he has a very public opinion about the NRA and about gun rights, which I agree, don't take away the Second Amendment. But the reason why, if this law is overturned, is because then it would affect a bill that's in the Senate right now, and it's called the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, and that's H.R. 38, which means that anybody, and this is getting to your point, with anybody that actually transports guns now illegally across state lines, it'll be legal for them to do that, which would then be impossible for the police to actually keep an eye on and to remember all the different laws. So Nevada has a very open rights as far as carrying guns. And so if you're a student or a faculty member on campus, you could have somebody that's in your classroom carrying a gun who has lived in another state, and they would have the right to do
I'm
that.
sorry to interrupt. What is the question?
The question is, what can we do about this?
Okay, great. There was a question over here as well.
Ricardo Bustamante, Community Impact at Columbia University. We've seen an increase in violence against police officers. My question would be, what is the position of police departments across the nation regarding background checks and limiting AR-15?
Okay, great. Okay, why don't we address the first question about the New York carry law, Cabot?
I'll take that one because I actually have a concealed carry permit, and I received in the state of Virginia. I went to class, I got certified, went to the courtroom, got my concealed carry permit, and bringing up the issue of being in New York City. I lived in New York City for the past year, and so I had to leave my firearm in the state of Virginia, my parents' home. And I think that when it comes to concealed carry legislation and reciprocity, I think that it only punishes law-abiding citizens when we restrict which states they're allowed to carry and which ones they're not. Concealed carry permit holders are less likely than the general population of gun owners to use their firearms for a crime. If you went out and took the time to abide by the law, go through a course, get a permit to carry a firearm, the odds of you using that gun in a crime are statistically lower, and I think that's illogical to think. And so I think that when it comes to reciprocity, I think we should make it easier, and we should make it more, I guess, more obvious on which laws people are allowed to carry. Because as a concealed carry permit holder, when I go to different states, there's very little reciprocity from state to state. But I think that when it comes down to someone in your class saying, I know someone in my class could have a firearm, I don't think that's reason for alarm necessarily. I actually carried when I was in college, and no one knew that I was. And I think that concealed carry permit holders are the last people that we should be worried about having firearms, as if it's some Wild West situation. They're less likely to use their firearms, statistically speaking, for crime. So I don't think that's the problem.
So I'll address that and maybe even tie in the other question about law enforcement, because the two issues are related. Well, for one, the Supreme Court case, it's worse than you think. It's not just about the ramifications of overturning what is ultimately a pretty small New York regulation, NYPD regulation, but it's what the court with a new majority will announce as a test for the Second Amendment right now. And one of the reasons why the Second Amendment doesn't need to change at all in order to have is because the Supreme Court opinion in Heller, which is only 10 years old, I want to remind the young people in the room, for the first couple hundred years in this country, there was no declared private right of gun ownership until the Supreme Court announced that right in 2008. But I'm more worried with the enunciation of the test than I am even the repercussions of the law. Law enforcement, go talk to the NYPD chief about what he thinks about concealed carry reciprocity in New York. This city gets, I don't know the number, but tens of millions of visitors every year. The police and the folks here locally have said, we don't believe that carrying in public is part of our culture, a part of the way our city gets to work. And the idea that tourists who are first time to New York from all over the country, encountering different experiences, including potentially, by the way, dangerous ones, whether they passed a test or not, whether they're the most upstanding of citizens or not, that is such it's a terrifying notion to major city police departments to have to now pick between the folks that are carrying from a state that has a permitless carrying system who just happen to be strolling out of a nightclub at 2 a.m. versus the person who's posing a threat to the community or to an officer. So they hate the idea. They've signed letters. They've lobbied, and the police chiefs.
In the NYPD, because in general there are still plenty of police chiefs that have no problem with concealed carry permit
I
holders.
mean, there
we're
are, and
talking about New York
there's
City.
even more sheriffs. But I guess the point is, when we're talking about culture, where sort of bring it back to where you started, when we're talking about there's a lot of nuance in the way. I think that cities, states should have a right to determine where their threshold is, and within the bounds of the law, but where the bounds are. So concealed carry reciprocity is a mess. I will also say to your question, with respect to background checks, again, when we're talking about police chiefs, I think sheriffs are a different story. But when you're talking about city police chiefs, background checks are an important part of not only keeping their force safe, keeping their community safe, but also when they do recover a gun in a crime, right? They trace that gun. And the only way they can trace that gun back is if a background check has been run. Without background checks on all sales, and I did this work from the law enforcement side, if you buy a gun subject to a background check at a dealer in Virginia, and then you sell that gun to your friend, and your friend sells it to his somewhat questionable cousin, and that cousin decides to drive it to New York and sell it to another. Now there's no chain. There's no chain. No chain that gets me anywhere near the events that happen. The point that I would love to leave all of you with is that Cabot is right. Law-abiding gun owners take some portion of the responsibility here, even though they are not themselves a threat. Even though we can be confident that so many people that decide to own a gun are really not a threat to society. But these are modest steps we're asking to stop downstream problems that are really enormous and socially completely unacceptable. And I think most gun owners are there.
Sonali, you seem like you want to jump in.
Just to sort of the issue around concealed carry reciprocity and just why these matter, and just to echo everything Nick just said, we also know, and I sometimes laugh that there is research that had to be conducted to demonstrate this, but we know that the presence of firearms is directly related to increased firearm violence. So even when you have law-abiding citizens, and this is not out of a lack of respect for them, rather it is out of concern for what happens 2-3 steps down the line, and how, as prevention researchers and those of us interested in preventing this kind of violence, which I think everyone here is, what do we do to do that, and how do we do that effectively? So the challenge of saying more guns does not equal less crime, which is sort of a favorite talking point, but that's just simply not true. And I think we have to be very, very clear when we say, what is the purpose of these kinds of legislative bills? What's the purpose of this reciprocity piece? Do we value that over the right to ride the subway safely? I don't think so. I think that the right to human life, first and foremost, in that vein, has to be prioritized. So I think this is where we just have to be having those conversations around, it's a little bit of common sense.
But they're not mutually exclusive, though, the right to life, and oftentimes the right to self-defense does defend the right to life. And also I think it's important pointing out, when we say more guns equals more gun violence, since 1993, there's been over a 50% increase in gun ownership rates in the United States, and gun violence rates have dropped in that time. So I think that's
not true.
Yeah, it is.
I don't want to get into like a he said, but right now, the 100,000 people who were shot with a gun in America last year.
Gun violence, much of that number, about 2/3 of that number is suicides.
Rob,
and so when we're talking about gun violence rates, since 1993, they have categorically dropped gun violence rates.
where do you fall on this, Rob, just to close this out?
I'm somebody who was married to a psychiatrist for 30 years, and it's real clear that the notion that if it's nearby, it will be used is something that you just can't ignore. Epidemiology is very clear about this. You take away the infectious agent, and the epidemic disappears.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I think we're out of time. We could go on and on and on about this, but thank you all for being here. Thanks.
Thank you all again for joining us, and thanks again to all of the panelists. Clearly, there's a lot to unpack here, and as Tiffany just said, we could go on and on and on about this. As I said in my introductory remarks, we are hoping that this is the beginning of the conversation for you all, not the end. And so along those lines, be on the lookout for video about today's conversation. Please review it. Please share it with folks who weren't able to join us today. And also as a reminder, information about events like this can be found in our newsletter, which comes out every other Tuesday. Be sure to open those and look for all of the opportunities and events that are listed in our newsletter. And as always, we welcome your thoughts and comments. You can write to us at universitylife@columbia.edu. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.